Welcome to our podcast, Minds Over Media. I'm Kara Hutchinson from the Southwest Ohio Instructional Technology Association, or SOITA. Today, my co-host is Sarah Schroder from the University of Cincinnati, and we're joined by our guest, Dr. Nancy Jennings, also from the University of Cincinnati. But before we dive into our media literacy discussion, Sarah and Nancy, can you talk about how this podcast came to be?
Well, Nancy Jennings and I got involved with media literacy when we started having conversations about how her work in communication research and my work in teacher education really could come together to impact how we used media in our schools. My background in my graduate work was studying media, and Nancy has a passion for studying children's media. And when we think about classrooms and started really looking into and having all of these crazy ideas about how we could support teachers out in the field through the work we do at UC and bringing our students into it, we got really excited about the idea of a podcast that was easy for teachers to access, that our students can contribute to, that our community partners we've collected over the years who are just brilliant and bring a wealth of resources. We just hated to keep it all to ourselves. And so grateful for SOITA and Kara bringing us on board for this and being willing to allow us to share our passion for this subject with teachers and our partners from all over the country that we've worked with, and their brilliance with teachers in the field to help change the way we address and use media in our classrooms, which is really the point of this podcast. So Nancy, why are you excited to share your work with media literacy with teachers K through 20 out in the field through this podcast partnership with SOITA?
For me, one of the most exciting things about it is that I get to share this knowledge that I have with other people. And that was that's always been part of my philosophy, my approach to being a professor is that if it doesn't get beyond the ivory tower, then then what's the point? So, I'm really excited about being able to connect with students, with teachers, with parents. That's what I'm passionate about. That's what brings me joy, and that I'm able to share some of this information, and hopefully, we can all learn from each other in the process as well.
Yeah, and I am so excited about the range of guests we have lined up for our future podcasts.
Definitely.
We're trying to weasel our way in to some organizations that we really respect their work and convince them that we are worth talking to on this podcast. But we're really excited. We've worked with filmmakers who've had great impact on the global scale, to local teachers who are making a huge difference in their classrooms, that have work that really needs to be shared at a broader level. And so this is going to be so much fun, and I can't wait to sit around and talk about all the things you and I nerd out about all the time in private, now in a really public forum. So teachers who nerd out about it too can feel like there's others out there to support their work and can reach out to us, can reach out, to the university, to SOITA, to get that extra support they need. We're here, and we are happy to talk more about it. And hopefully we can even bring together some live conversations with all of you teachers listening, so that we can continue to share ideas and build this community.
I think that's a great explanation. I'd like to start off our media literacy discussion by asking, how would you define media literacy, Nancy?
Sure. So I think of media literacy as like a framework to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and participate with messages in a wide variety of forms. And it's kind of evolved and developed over time, so that Renee Hobbs, one of the leading scholars in the field, has also kind of added a notion of ACT as one of the last steps of media literacy, to really think about personal interpretation, deepening the idea of engaging with media, and really acting on your interpretation and your as a form of citizenship.
Yeah. Well, and if we think about it, we're interacting with media every day, all day for most of us. We're constantly in contact with some sort of media. And I guess maybe it would be helpful too to talk about what is considered media.
Yeah. So my take on media, it's a wide variety of things these days. So I think we used to think of it as just screens, just
Mm-hmm.
like the television screen or the movie theater. But now it's like you said, it's kind of everywhere.
Yeah.
We carry it in our pocket. We we do still go to theaters. We do
Mm.
still have television screens, but we listen to radio. We listen to podcasts. We go to concerts. That's a form of media as
Yeah.
well. We're listening to that music. So it comes in a wide variety of forms and platforms.
Well, and Nancy, if I could ask a follow-up question on that, as teachers in K-12 or higher education classrooms, where do you see our responsibility being to make sure our students are taking a literacy approach to media, using it like a text in the classroom? And, where do you see this happening out in the schools? And where do you think we need to go with it?
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So I always think of whenever somebody refers to media as a text, I actually think back to my first days in graduate school when that was first introduced to me, and this concept of that media is a text and that television is a text and the show is a text. I'm like, wait, but I'm not reading that, but you are, what I mean, in a different kind of way. You're interpreting the message that you're getting. You're deciphering. You're taking your own perspective and adding it to your understanding of this shared meaning that we're getting from the message. So I think it's really important that as teachers, we really think about how kids are receiving these messages and what is their position, what are they thinking about when they get these kinds of messages, and how can we help them to understand that sometimes messages have different meanings for different people, and that some messages may need fact checking as well.
Well, I know, Nancy, my students who are mostly pre-service teachers, we got into a debate last week about what's the role of the teacher in all of this. They thought it was the parents' job to handle all of this with their students. They were like, one, two, three, not me, right? But what do you see in your research coming out in terms of the role that schools can play or teachers can play in this? Is it the teacher's responsibility to bring these texts into the classroom in a critical way?
In a critical way, yes. I mean, I think it's everybody's responsibility. I think it's the parents. I think it's the teachers. I think it's the community members. It takes a village, right, to raise a child, and so we need to be able to be able to engage in lots of different ways. And I often find that parents too. I mean, I'm a parent, and I've got a lot of responsibilities, and so sometimes trying to pick the right thing, or getting some help from somebody else, getting some advice, being a media mentor, is what I need, and that's what teachers can do, and they can help facilitate that for parents as well as for the students.
I love that language of teachers being a media mentor. Can I steal that from my class?
Absolutely.
Excellent. I think that's a great lens to take as a teacher when we look at our role of how media fits in our classroom.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and two, just being a role model, being cognizant of, you you have eyes that are watching all the time, whether you want to believe it or not.
Yes,
And
that's so important.
yeah, just being a role model, I think, being aware.
Yeah, and that's something that definitely comes out of the literature, right? Out of the research, is
Mm-hmm.
that the kids are watching their parents as they engage with media. So if the parents on their phone all the time, then they think that's okay, and so that, if your teenager ends up on the phone all the time, they're like, well, you do it, why can't I? So
Mm-hmm.
so there is a lot of that modeling, and that, teachers spend a lot of time with students too,
Mm-hmm.
so they're, we've got lots of models. It's not just the parents, it's the teachers as well.
What kind of challenges when it comes to media literacy are there?
They are abundant. There are a number of challenges for teachers in terms of bringing media into the schools, and into their classroom, and some of it is, it's just strictly technologically. Sometimes the the Wi-Fi isn't very strong at the school, or that they may not have the um, bright technology that they need in order to um, to be the best media mentor they can be.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes that can be a little bit of a conflict, but there's also a level of protection, right? That the schools are also establishing guidelines and rules around media use in the classroom, and internet access and things like that. So it's trying to find a balance there between kind of how you manage both sides, right? Being able to
Mm-hmm.
give exposure, but then also being able to protect. Um, and I think that's just one aspect. If we think about that, it can bring in different voices, and it can bring in different points of view, and so sometimes it's a challenge with and it is a challenge with parents, that parents may have a different viewpoint or a different orientation to the messages, to the media, or even just to media use in general.
Mm-hmm.
They may have guidelines and rules about what they expect at home, and with the school violates those rules, then it can be concerning to parents. So so there's a lot of kind of give and take,
Mm-hmm.
when trying to incorporate media literacy into the classroom, and really, trying to form a partnership, with your administrators, with your tech team, with the parents as well, so that you can be most effective with it.
What is too early to
Oh,
expose like the
yes.
ideas behind media literacy or the concepts or um, that critical lens?
I would say it's never too early.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because media literacy can go, all the way down to the youngest of children, all the way, through adults. And we're still learning. We're still learning.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think, now you're not, developmentally, you're not going to get as, deep of a lesson perhaps, about, critical viewing,
Yeah.
with your kindergartners, but you're definitely can talk about, like, how much time are you spending with media, what kinds of content are you looking at? Do you like to watch educational content? Do you like to watch, video games? How much time are you spending with video games? Different types of things like that. And what kinds of video games are you playing? Is it first person shooters, or is it other types of games that might be better suited for that age group? So
Mm.
those are just some things to think about.
Well, and I know in a lot of classrooms, we've even seen just putting a picture up on the screen can be really, really powerful from kindergarten through college classrooms. You get a different read clearly from a kindergartner than from a college student,
Yeah.
but asking asking students, what do you see? What do you wonder? We see English curriculum or literacy curriculum out there for reading and asking these questions. And they're starting to incorporate more images, looking at book covers, looking at a movie trailer, what conventions are they using? What images are we seeing a lot of? And those types of questions can be really, really accessible for younger students as well, and teach those critical thinking skills. Nancy, in your experience with media literacy, what role do you see critical thinking playing that could potentially impact students, in other subject areas or outside of the classroom?
That's good. So I think the important one of the important parts about media literacy is perspective taking, right? So it's not only that like they have to recognize, everybody has to recognize that they have their own perspective as they're receiving a message, as they're watching a television show, but also we need to think about what was the intended message. What was the producer thinking of when they were making the message, and then how do we work together to get a shared message and a shared meaning out of that? So I do think that it's important to be able to kind of tease out some of those perspectives, and to tease out the the intentionality of the message and the use. Why are you using it? Why that's another one of our things we talk about in terms of, we would call it uses and gratifications. But are you using it to relax? Are you using it to get excited? What types of things can the media help to support for you? Are you using it to calm, to soothe?
That's interesting, because I guess I've never thought about that side of it. And I am also curious how the idea of, digital citizenship plays into media literacy. Are they two kind of separate entities, or are they kind of all under an umbrella, but of like cyber safety and the trail we leave behind, and you being the commodity when something is free, and are all of those concepts part of media literacy? Or what's your view on that?
Yeah. So I do think it's all under one umbrella. And that, thinking about cybersecurity and your own safety and things like that are definitely part of that media literacy component. Knowing that your information is being shared and being spread and can be captured, and used for other purposes, whether it be for advertising or political engagement. I mean, these things are captured. So it's important to be that critical person, and that critical media user, to know that it, just because it's free, there's a cost, right? Mm-hmm. So you're giving up some of your information in order for it to be free. So
that's one of those things where I always struggle with the difference between the two. Wonder how it weaves in with the digital citizenship part of all of that.
Yeah.
It weaves in really beautifully with the digital citizenship pieces of it. And there's a fabulous report that came out. We can share in the resources for this podcast, for all the teachers, that came out about 2 years ago now, I guess, from the National Association of Media Literacy Education. And one of the big pieces of the impact of media literacy in the classroom was citizenship. And if we connect that to the IST standards for citizenship, and you really dig into the responsibility with students of, all right, you're producing this stuff now. You're not just a viewer of it. So you're producing it, you're sharing it. We're in a whole different world than when Nancy and I were young and all you watched were 3 channels on your television. Now we have the fire hydrant of media just drowning us every day, but we're also producing it and sharing it. And so that idea of being a producer consumer at the same time, now what's our responsibility, becomes an incredibly powerful conversation with students when you're talking about the role that sharing other perspectives, other voices, examining those, as Nancy said earlier, developing a shared perspective, which I think can really create community in your classroom when you're talking about a shared perspective of media. What do we hold in common? When we're using these things, whether it's how we use them or why we use them or how we produce them or our goal in producing them. It's fascinating for students, I think, to think about that piece of media, which they really hadn't thought about before when they're primarily consumers. But that anomaly report is powerful, and we will share that in the resources for the podcast for everyone.
Yeah, and I was also thinking as you were talking about like knowledge building, that we are creators and consumers at the same time, and that's part of that's an element of citizenry that we may not really think about too much. That the citizenship and democracy works when we have informed voters and when we have informed participants in conversation. And so, if we're going to be informed, we need to be able to see what's in the media, but then also question that. Mm-hmm. Take a look at what is the intention, who made those messages, and do you agree with them? Do you not agree with them? And why or why not? And so I think that also helps when we're thinking about action with media literacy, that it's it is important to watch the news. It is important to take a critical stance when receiving information that you might question, and think about what is the intention of that person? What is the intention of that message? Is it persuasive? And how is it being persuasive?
And remembering what voices are we hearing and which ones aren't we hearing?
True.
By the choices we make and what we choose to pay attention to in the media, what voices are we leaving out when we don't include a more diverse range of media in our everyday experience can be really powerful for students.
Absolutely. We get in those bubbles, right? We get in and the platforms themselves kind of reinforce those bubbles, because through the algorithms and whatnot. So yeah, it is important to punch through the bubble and see what else is out there.
Yeah, and you have to be aware in order to,
right,
recognize the fact that that's what's happening so that you can
absolutely
pop the bubble to get out.
Yeah.
So Nancy, in classrooms, do you think media literacy can fit into most subject areas or grade levels in some capacity, or do you think this is a really a role for a specific subject area in school?
I think it can be carried across the curriculum. There are so many different ways that I can see it being used, in terms of like, how is science talked about? How is math? How is how are all these different topics discussed? And what is the value that we give these topics as well? So thinking about how those messages are being conveyed about science, who's being depicted as being a scientist, those are important questions. so there's all kinds of different ways it can be incorporated. Um, it's not just, for the English teachers or social studies teachers or language arts, but it can be used in a wide variety of different ways.
Yeah. Well, how, I guess, if I was a teacher listening to this and wanted to do a better job with media literacy, what advice would you give me to get started tomorrow? Like something, like how could I, you know, simply, I mean, I guess, kind of get started or try something? Or do you have any ideas for that?
So I think with media literacy, it's little steps, right? So it's you don't have to take the whole thing and try to do it on the first day.
Hmm.
You don't need to, you're not going to create a critical thinker in one day.
Yeah.
So introducing little parts and little pieces. Even just simply doing an exercise where you ask them to track how much media they're using, to
Hmm.
track what kinds of messages they see. Bring in, like Sarah was saying, bring in a picture. Bring in a picture from some kind of content, whether it be the newspaper or um, I mean, we bring in picture books for kindergartners, right?
Right. Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
is bringing in pictures and texts, So just start that conversation, start a conversation, ask
Yeah.
them what's on their mind. If you've got older students, really, so it will kind of depend on, what age group of student that you're working with, but yeah, just don't feel like completely overwhelmed that you have to do everything, and try everything, just little
Yeah.
bits at a
Yeah.
time. So we've been talking quite a bit too about like how children interpret media messages and reading of the text, reading of the pictures, but we also have to remember that we've been talking too that they're creators as well. So having them get involved, that's part of media literacy as well, the creation of messages, having them take pictures, having them create a video, to create a podcast. There's a wide variety of things that children can do, and it can empower them to share their own pictures and their own perspective that they may not be seeing.
No, I think that's great.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I've seen second graders do interpretations of Knuffle Bunny. But, we sat down with second graders and asked them, what did you notice about Knuffle Bunny when you read it, about the pictures? And then what did you notice about the words and how did it make you feel? What did you like about it? And it was amazing when they started thinking through with a book like Knuffle Bunny, oh, the girl lives in a city. I haven't seen a book before where the girl lived in a city. And we were talking to urban students who never really read a book, where they'd seen kids living in the city before. It wasn't on a farm with chickens and cows, which we see a lot of in children's books. And then they noticed that it was mixed media. I mean, clearly they didn't use the language of mixed media, but by the end they could talk
mhm.
about it, second graders mixing media. And then when they created their own stories, they combined drawings and pictures and their own words and to tell their stories. And it
Mhm.
can be incredibly empowering for students when they have a chance to create their own art, their own media, their own stories, tell the stories of their neighborhoods, their communities, their families, children who look like them, which now we see much more of in libraries and on bookshelves, but a decade ago we didn't. And
Yeah.
so getting in that habit of taking advantage of these brilliant students who have stories of joy to tell, I think that's one other thing Nancy and I have talked about in the past. And Nancy, please feel free to expand on this. But, we see so many stories, particularly of children of color, children in urban communities that are stories of sadness, and allowing these students to have opportunities to interpret stories of joy for themselves and their communities, or create those stories, can be another way media literacy can be incredibly empowering.
No, I think that's great. Thank you, ladies, for the discussion today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kara, for having us.
Thanks for listening to our Minds Over Media podcast. We hope you enjoyed our conversation today and learned something new. You can find the show notes, resources, and information on earning contact hours for listening at teachercampus.org. Minds Over Media is produced by the Southwestern Ohio Instructional Technology Association in partnership with the University of Cincinnati.